He walked into the wedding alone and sat at the last table in the back, just as he had lived for years, silent, avoiding, unnoticed. As a black single father, Mohis had grown used to being looked past rather than looked at. But then, in a room full of couples, a woman suddenly stood up, cutting through the whispers, and said something no one expected. "Don't look at him. Look at me." How did that single moment change everything for a man who had spent years becoming invisible? Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. The smell of sawdust had become Mohis's favorite thing in the world. Not because he loved woodworking more than anything else, but because sawdust meant solitude. It meant his garage on a Saturday morning, the familiar weight of a sanding block in his palm, and the certainty that no one would ask him questions he didn't want to answer. He ran his hand along the arm of the old rocking chair he'd been restoring for 3 weeks now. The wood was smooth, almost ready. He could take his time. No deadline, no expectations, just him and the grain of the oak, speaking a language that required no explanations. This was the world Mohis had built for himself over the past 8 years. Small, quiet, controlled. A world where he decided who entered and when, where every interaction had a clear beginning and end, and where he never had to stand in a room full of couples, wondering why everyone kept glancing at the man who came alone. The garage door creaked open behind him, and light flooded in along with his daughter's voice. "I know you saw it." Mohis didn't turn around. He kept sanding, even though the wood was already smooth enough. "Saw what?" "The invitation, on the kitchen counter. The one you've been pretending doesn't exist for 2 weeks." Iris walked around the workbench and stood directly in his line of sight. She was 14 now, tall for her age, with her mother's sharp eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. In her hand, she held the cream-colored envelope Mohis had been strategically ignoring every time he walked past the kitchen. "I'm busy," he said. "You're hiding." "I'm restoring a chair." "You've been restoring that chair since before Christmas. It's February." Iris set the envelope down on the workbench, right next to his sanding block. "Clinton's getting married. Your best friend from college. The guy you still text every New Year's Eve like clockwork." Mohis finally looked up. "We're not best friends anymore. People grow apart." "People grow apart when one of them stops showing up." Iris crossed her arms. "When's the last time you went anywhere that wasn't the hardware store or my school?" He didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Mohis had perfected the art of declining invitations over the years. Birthday parties, neighborhood barbecues, holiday gatherings, class reunions. He had an excuse for each one, delivered so smoothly that people eventually stopped asking. It was easier that way. Easier than walking into a room and feeling the weight of curious stares, the whispered questions that followed him like shadows. "Where's his wife?" "He came alone?" "Must be hard, raising a kid by himself." "Poor thing." Those 2 words were the worst. Poor thing. As if his entire existence could be summarized in a pitying glance and a shake of the head. As if being a single father, a black man navigating spaces designed for couples, made him something to be looked at rather than looked with. So he stopped going. Stopped putting himself in rooms where he'd become the subject of someone else's quiet commentary. It was easier to be invisible by choice than to be invisible while standing right in front of people. "Dad." Iris's voice softened. "I already RSVP'd for you." Mohis's hand stopped mid-motion. "You what?" "Last week. I found the invitation, I went online, and I said you'd be there." "Iris, you can't just—" "Yes, I can. Because you never will." She picked up the envelope and held it out to him. "You avoid everything because you're scared of people looking at you. You think I don't notice. But I do. I notice when you park far away from school so you don't have to walk past the other parents. I notice when you make up excuses to skip my choir concerts because you don't want to sit in the auditorium alone. I notice everything." Mohis set down the sanding block. His chest felt tight, the way it always did when Iris saw too much. "But you know what else I notice?" she continued. "I look at you every single day, Dad, and I have never, not once, been ashamed of you. So maybe it's time you stop being ashamed of yourself." She placed the invitation in his hand, turned around, and walked back into the house. The garage door swung shut behind her, leaving Mohis alone with the smell of sawdust and the weight of his daughter's words. He looked down at the envelope. "Clinton Mitchell and Kara Collins request the pleasure of your company." The wedding was next Saturday, 7 days away, 7 days to find an excuse, to call and apologize, to explain that something came up. But Iris had already said yes. Mohis walked to the small mirror hanging on the garage wall, the one he used to check for sawdust in his hair before going inside. He stared at his reflection. 38 years old, strong hands, tired eyes. A man who had spent nearly a decade making himself smaller and smaller until he could almost disappear entirely. Is this what his daughter saw every day? A father who was afraid to exist in the same room as other people? He thought about the night his wife left. No warning, no explanation. Just a note on the kitchen table and an empty closet. Iris had been 6 years old, asking where Mommy went, and Mohis had no answer to give her. So, he gave her everything else instead. He gave her stability, routine, a father who was always there when she came home from school. He gave her a life that was small but safe. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that small was enough. But looking at the invitation in his hand, feeling the echo of his daughter's words in his chest, Mohis realized something. Iris wasn't asking him to be brave for himself. She was asking him to stop hiding from the world she would one day have to navigate alone. The wedding venue was exactly the kind of place Mohis had avoided for years. Golden chandeliers cast warm light across white tablecloths. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases on every table. A string quartet played softly in the corner while guests mingled with champagne glasses in hand, laughing, touching shoulders, leaning into each other the way people do when they belong together. Everyone had a pair, a partner, a +1. Mohis arrived 15 minutes late on purpose. It was a strategy he'd developed over the years for the rare events he couldn't escape. Show up after the mingling, find a seat in the back, eat quickly, leave before anyone noticed he was there. The moment he stepped through the door, he felt it. That familiar sensation of eyes moving toward him, quick glances, followed by whispered words. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could imagine. "Is that Mohis? I thought Clinton said he never comes to anything." He's alone. Of course he's alone. Didn't his wife leave him years ago? Wonder what happened there. Mohis kept his head down and made his way toward the back of the room. There was a table near the emergency exit, half hidden by a large potted plant. Perfect. He could sit there, watch the ceremony, eat something, and slip out before the dancing started. He pulled out a chair and sat down, exhaling slowly. 2 hours. He could survive 2 hours. The emergency exit is 12 steps away. Mohis looked up. A woman was already sitting at the table, her chair angled toward the same door he'd been eyeing. She hadn't been there a moment ago, or maybe she had been and he'd been too focused on his escape route to notice. "I counted," she added, not quite smiling but not frowning either, just stating a fact. Despite himself, Mohis laughed. It came out rough, unpracticed, like a machine that hadn't been used in months. 12 steps, good to know. I figured someone should do the math in advance. The woman turned her chair slightly toward him. She was about his age, with natural hair pulled back and eyes that seemed to notice everything without judging any of it. "I'm Naomi, cousin of the bride, the one nobody knows what to do with at family events. Mohis, friend of the groom, the one who hasn't actually talked to the groom in about 5 years. Naomi tilted her head. "Then why did you come?" It was such a direct question that Mohis almost didn't answer. But something about the way she asked it, without pretense or pity, made him tell the truth. My daughter. She RSVP'd for me before I could say no. The corner of Naomi's mouth lifted. How old is she? 14. Sounds like she's the only person in your life who won't let you escape. Mois thought about Iris standing in the garage, holding that envelope like a weapon. Yeah, she's annoyingly good at that. Naomi nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something she'd been wondering about. My mother is the same way. Refuses to let me skip these things. Says I've spent enough time hiding. Hiding from what? Naomi looked out at the crowd of couples on the dance floor, then back at Mohis. From being the woman who shows up alone and has to explain why. From the questions people ask when they think they're being polite, but really they just want to know what's wrong with you. Mohis felt something shift in his chest. A recognition. A strange, unexpected relief at sitting across from someone who seemed to understand exactly what it felt like to walk into a room and become a question mark in everyone's mind. I was planning to leave after the appetizers, he admitted. Naomi glanced at the emergency exit. 12 steps, I'll race you. For the first time in longer than Mohis could remember, he didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not while there was someone at this table who looked at him like he was a person instead of a problem. They talked through the appetizers, then through the salad course, then through the main course. Mohis hadn't intended to stay this long. His original plan had been surgical. Arrive late, eat fast, leave before anyone could corner him with uncomfortable questions. But somehow, between Naomi's dry observations about the bride's aunt, who kept refilling her wine glass, and his own stories about Iris's increasingly elaborate schemes to get him out of the house, the hours had slipped away. It felt strange, this ease. Mohis couldn't remember the last time he'd had a conversation that didn't feel like work. With most people, talking required constant calibration. How much to share? How to deflect the inevitable questions about his wife, his past, his life. But with Naomi, there was none of that. She didn't ask where his partner was. She didn't offer sympathy he hadn't requested. She just talked to him like he was a person sitting across a table, which shouldn't have felt remarkable, but somehow did. He was in the middle of describing Iris's reaction to his attempt at making homemade pizza when he noticed it. A shift in the room. The women at the table nearest to them had stopped their own conversation and were now watching, not even trying to hide it. One of them leaned toward another and whispered something behind her hand. The second woman glanced over at Mohis and Naomi, then quickly looked away when she realized Mohis had seen her. The familiar tightness returned to his chest, that old sensation of being observed, catalogued, discussed. They've been doing that for about 20 minutes, Naomi said quietly. She hadn't stopped looking at him, but her voice had shifted. Softer now. More careful. Mohis forced himself to keep his expression neutral. Doing what? Watching us. Talking about us. Naomi picked up her water glass, but didn't drink from it. I can see them in the reflection of the window behind you. Of course she could. Of course she'd noticed before he had. Mohis realized that Naomi had probably been tracking the stairs since the moment they'd started talking, filing them away while still managing to hold a conversation as if nothing was wrong. Because for people like them, this was normal, the surveillance, the whispered commentary. The sense that their presence in a room full of couples was somehow a disruption that needed to be explained. I should probably... Mohis started to push back his chair. You don't have to leave. I'm not leaving. I was just going to... He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't know how. Get some air? Find the bathroom? All the excuses he'd used over the years to extract himself from situations exactly like this one. Naomi set down her glass. I used to do the same thing. Whenever I felt people watching, I'd find a reason to disappear. Get a drink. Make a phone call. Anything to remove myself from their line of sight. Mohis said nothing. His hands had curled into fists under the table. My ex-husband used to tell me I was imagining things, Naomi continued, that I was being paranoid, that nobody cared about us as much as I thought they did. A small, bitter smile crossed her face. But I wasn't imagining it. I was just the only one paying attention. The women at the next table burst into laughter. One of them looked directly at Mohis, then turned back to her friends with an expression he recognized. The same look he'd seen countless times before at parent-teacher conferences, grocery stores, anywhere he existed as a single black man in spaces where people expected him to have a partner. Curiosity, pity, judgment, all wrapped up in a glance that lasted less than a second, but carried the weight of every assumption they'd ever made about men like him. I was married for 7 years, Naomi said. The words came out steady, as if she'd rehearsed them many times. To a man who looked perfect on paper. Good job. Nice family. The kind of person your relatives brag about at holidays. Mohis turned his attention back to her, grateful for something to focus on besides the eyes he could feel on the back of his neck. But the whole time I was with him, I was shrinking. Naomi's fingers traced the rim of her water glass. That's the only word for it. Every year I got smaller, laughing quieter so I wouldn't embarrass him, having fewer opinions so I wouldn't start arguments, wearing what he liked, going where he wanted, becoming whatever version of myself made his life easier. She looked up at Mohis. By the end, I couldn't even remember what my own voice sounded like. Not the one I used to survive my marriage, my real voice. Mohis thought about his garage, the sawdust, the silence he'd cultivated so carefully over the years. He'd always told himself he was protecting Iris, building a stable life for her. But sitting here, listening to Naomi describe her own disappearing act, he recognized something uncomfortably familiar. They had both learned to make themselves invisible. Different methods, same result. "When did you finally leave?" he asked. 3 years ago. And honestly, the marriage ending wasn't the hard part. The hard part was learning how to take up space again. Naomi gestured at the crowded room around them. That's why I come to these things now. Not because I enjoy them, but because every time I walk into a room alone and don't apologize for it, I'm reminding myself that I have the right to exist without permission. Before Mohis could respond, the microphone at the front of the room crackled to life. The MC, a cheerful man in a gray suit, tapped it twice and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We're about to begin the toasts, but first, I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate Clinton and Kara." The room quieted. Couples shifted in their seats, angling toward the front. Mohis felt Naomi tense beside him. "Now I know we have a lot of happy couples in the room tonight," the MC continued, grinning at the crowd. "But I also want to give a special shout-out to everyone who came alone. You brave souls who showed up without a +1 sitting in the back, probably already planning your escape routes." Scattered laughter rippled through the room. Mohis felt his stomach drop as several heads turned in his direction. The back table, the one near the emergency exit. The one where the two single people had been talking all night. "We see you," the MC added with a wink. "And hey, maybe by the end of tonight you won't be leaving alone. You never know." More laughter. Someone wolf whistled. Mohis stared at the tablecloth, willing himself to become invisible, to dissolve into the fabric of his chair and cease to exist entirely. The whispers at the next table were louder now, not even bothering to hide. "That's Mohis, right? Clinton's friend? I thought he never came to anything. He couldn't find anyone to bring. Can you imagine? I heard his wife left him years ago. Just walked out one day. There must have been a reason, you know." "Poor thing, raising a daughter all by himself. No wonder he looked so worn out." Poor thing. There it was. The phrase Mohis had spent 8 years trying to outrun. The words that reduced his entire life, all his sacrifices, all his love for his daughter, into something small and pitiable and less than. He started to stand. He would leave now, before the toasts, before the dancing, before anyone else could look at him and see nothing but a problem in need of explanation. But before he could push back his chair, Naomi stood up first. The movement was sudden enough that the women at the next table stopped whispering. A few other heads turned. Naomi wasn't walking toward the exit or the bathroom. She was just standing there in the middle of the reception, looking directly at the women who had been watching them all night. "I can hear you." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear and steady and impossible to ignore. The room went quiet. The MC stopped shuffling his notes. Clinton, sitting at the head table with his new bride, looked up with confusion on his face. Naomi continued, "I can hear you looking at him, talking about him, deciding what kind of person he is based on the fact that he walked in here without a date." One of the women at the next table opened her mouth as if to protest, but Naomi didn't give her the chance. "So let me make this easy for you. Don't look at him. If you need someone to stare at, someone to whisper about, someone to pity so you can feel better about your own life, look at me." She spread her arms slightly, as if presenting herself for inspection. "I'm also here alone. I'm also divorced. I'm also the person you don't know what to do with at events like this. So if you need a target, I'm right here. But leave him alone." The silence that followed was absolute. Mohis couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He stared at Naomi, this woman he'd met barely 2 hours ago, who had just drawn every eye in the room to herself to take the weight off his shoulders. No one had ever done that for him before. No one had ever stood up in a crowded room and said, "He is not the problem here. I am not the problem here. The way you look at us is the problem." Naomi sat back down. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass, but her face remained calm, defiant. The room slowly returned to life. The MC cleared his throat and launched into the first toast, his voice a little too bright, a little too eager to move past what had just happened. Conversations resumed at other tables, though Mohis noticed that the women who had been whispering were now staring at their plates in silence. Clinton appeared at their table, his face a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Mohis, I'm so sorry. If anyone made you uncomfortable..." "It's fine," Mohis said, though the words came out rough. "I had no idea people were... I didn't hear what they were saying, but clearly something..." Clinton ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I should have called you more. After everything that happened with your wife, I just didn't know what to say, and then time passed, and... Clinton." Mohis looked at his old friend, really looked at him for the first time in years. "It's fine. Go back to your bride. Enjoy your night." Clinton hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but eventually nodded and retreated to the head table. Mohis turned to Naomi. She was still holding her water glass, still not drinking from it. Up close, he could see that her hands hadn't stopped shaking. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know. You made yourself a target. I've been a target my whole life." Naomi finally set the glass down. "I just got tired of pretending I couldn't see the people aiming." Mohis stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked toward the emergency exit. 12 steps. He could be out of here in less than 30 seconds. Back to his car. Back to his garage. Back to the small, safe world he'd built where no one could look at him and make him feel like less than nothing. But if he left now, Naomi would be sitting here alone. The woman who had just taken a bullet for him would be left to face the aftermath by herself. And worse than that, if he left, he would be proving everyone right. He would be exactly what they thought he was. A man who couldn't handle being seen. A man who ran away the moment things got difficult. A man who had spent so long being invisible that he'd forgotten he had the right to exist. "You can go if you want," Naomi said, as if reading his thoughts. "I didn't do that to keep you here. I did it because I'm tired of watching people be treated like they're broken just because they're alone." Mohis looked at the exit, then at Naomi. then at the crowded room full of couples who had already moved on to the next topic of conversation, already forgotten the brief disruption at the back table. He had a choice to make. Mohis's phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it. His mind was still reeling from what had just happened, from the silence that had followed Naomi's words, from the choice that sat in front of him like a locked door he wasn't sure he had the key to open. But the phone buzzed again, and again. He pulled it out and saw Iris's name on the screen. 3 messages in quick succession. The first one read, "Dad, I know you're probably planning to leave early. You always do." The second, "But before you go, I need you to remember something." The third was longer. Mohis had to scroll to read the whole thing. "When I was 8, you took me to my first parent-teacher conference by yourself. Remember? You stood outside the classroom door for like 10 minutes because you were scared to go in alone. I watched you through the window. You kept looking at all the other parents walking in with their partners, and I could tell you wanted to leave. But then you took a deep breath and you walked in anyway. And when the teacher asked, 'Where is Iris's parent?' you raised your hand and said, 'I'm right here.' I never forgot that. Not because you were brave, but because you didn't run away. Please don't run away tonight either." Mohis read the message 3 times. His vision blurred, and he had to blink hard to clear it. He remembered that night. The fluorescent lights of the elementary school hallway, the sound of happy couples chatting as they walked past him into the classroom, the weight of being the only single father in a sea of complete families. He remembered standing outside that door, telling himself it would be easier to just go home, to email the teacher later, to find any excuse that would spare him from walking into a room where everyone would look at him and wonder what was wrong with him, what had happened to his wife, why he couldn't hold his family together. But Iris had been inside that classroom. Iris had been waiting for him. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. He'd walked in. He'd raised his hand. He'd said, "I'm right here," in a voice that didn't shake, even though everything inside him was trembling. And afterward, when they were walking back to the car, Iris had slipped her small hand into his and said, "You were the only dad who came by himself. I think that's really cool." Not embarrassed, not ashamed, proud. She had been proud of him. Mohis looked up from his phone. The reception was still going on around him. Couples were moving toward the dance floor as the first slow song began to play. The women who had been whispering earlier were carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone at the back table. Naomi was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Patient, curious, waiting to see what he would do next. "My daughter," Mohis said, holding up the phone. "She just reminded me of something I forgot." "What's that?" "That she's been watching me her whole life. And the version of me she's proudest of isn't the one who hides. It's the one who shows up anyway." Naomi nodded slowly. "Smart kid." "Too smart." Mohis put the phone back in his pocket. "She gets it from her mother." The words came out before he could stop them, and for a moment Mohis froze. He never talked about his ex-wife, never mentioned her in casual conversation. But somehow, sitting here with Naomi after everything that had happened, the reference didn't feel like a wound being reopened. It just felt like a fact, part of his history, part of who he was. He took a breath. Then he looked at Naomi and said something he hadn't planned to say. "Thank you. Not for standing up for me. I mean, yes, for that too, but also for showing me something." "What did I show you?" "That being seen doesn't have to be a punishment." Mohis gestured at the room around them. "I've spent 8 years treating visibility like a sentence. Like if people looked at me, they'd only see what was missing. The wife who left. The partner I don't have. The pieces of my life that don't fit the picture everyone expects." He shook his head. "But you stood up in front of all these people and you didn't apologize for existing. You didn't shrink. You just said, 'Here I am,' and dared anyone to have a problem with it." Naomi's expression softened. It took me 3 years after my divorce to learn how to do that, and honestly, most days I'm still figuring it out. Well, you're ahead of me. Mohis pushed back his chair and stood up, not toward the exit this time, toward the center of the room. Naomi looked up at him. Where are you going? I'm not sure yet, but I'm tired of sitting in the back. He took a step away from the table, then another. The emergency exit was still 12 steps away in the opposite direction, but for the first time all night, Mohis wasn't counting. The dance floor was crowded with couples swaying to a slow song he didn't recognize. Mohis stopped at the edge of it, not quite joining in, but not hiding either. Just standing there, present, visible. He felt Naomi arrive beside him before he saw her. She didn't say anything, just stood next to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, facing the same direction. They weren't dancing. They weren't holding hands. They were just two people who had spent years making themselves small, standing in the middle of a room and taking up space. Across the dance floor, Clinton caught Mois's eye. The groom smiled, a real smile this time, and raised his champagne glass in a small salute. Mois nodded back. "Do you think tonight changes anything?" Naomi asked quietly. Mois considered the question. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I don't want to disappear." That's a start. The song changed to something faster, but neither of them moved. They stayed at the edge of the dance floor, watching the celebration unfold around them, no longer trying to hide from it. Mohis pulled out his phone one more time and typed a message to Iris. "I didn't run. I'll tell you about it when I get home. Love you." The response came almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting by her phone all night. "I knew you wouldn't." Mohis smiled. It felt unfamiliar on his face, like a muscle that hadn't been used in months. But it also felt right. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked out at the crowded room. All these people, all these couples, all these lives intersecting for one night. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a man who had spent 8 years being invisible was finally allowing himself to be seen. Not because someone had given him permission, not because the world had suddenly become kinder, but because a 14-year-old girl had refused to let him hide, and a stranger had stood up in a crowded room and said, "Look at me," so that he wouldn't have to carry the weight of everyone's stares alone. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person who refuses to let you disappear. One moment that cracks open the door you've been hiding behind, and then the choice is yours. Stay in the shadows or step into the light and see what happens next. Mohis took a deep breath. He stepped forward.